Hi, everyone. My name is Drew Goldstein. I am a partner in the People and Organization practice with McKinsey and Company. I lead our Culture and Experience Solutions Group, and I'm also the founder of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Solutions Group. So I help organizations collect the right data associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion to be meaningful and deliberate about their strategy. I'd also be remiss if I didn't tell you why I'm passionate about the subject. As a gay male, I know what it's like to not feel included both inside and outside of work simply because of who you love. I'm also joined here today with Indhira Arrington, who is the Chief Diversity Officer globally and also a partner at Aries Management, and she has seen this play out dozens of times. So Indhira, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Drew. So again, Indhira Arrington, and I serve as the Global Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Aries Management. And the way that I think about my role is to truly focus on embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything that we do, from our human capital processes to our business processes, with a specific focus on thinking about it as a system and making long-term systemic change.
So Indhira, as you know, right, you've seen this play out both in a very positive manner, and you've seen some organizations go through some challenges, or pitfalls rather. And at McKinsey and Company, we know that organizations have 5 stages that they follow so that they can be very methodical with their DE&I approach, right? So the first one is setting an aspiration, right? Thinking about where they want to go and defining it. The second is assessing, making sure that they're collecting the right levels of data to inform the plan. The third, once they have the data, is architecting the right plan. And once you architect and establish what are the ingredients for the plan, is acting upon it, developing the action plan. And then last but not least, since this is ongoing, it's a lather, rinse, and repeat, you advance. And that's really making sure that you're measuring and managing how you think through your DE&I strategy. So you'll notice it's 5 A's, it's an alliteration so that it's easy to remember: aspire, assess, architect, act, and advance. So what I'd love to chat with you today is about some of the pitfalls and some of the best practices that you've seen play out and how you've deployed them in your role as the Global Chief Diversity Officer at Aries Management. So let's start with the first 2 A's, the aspiration, setting your aspiration, and also thinking through assess. Now, what I've seen with some of the pitfalls and the traps is that in the aspiration, we see something called a copycat syndrome, right? Saying, gosh, they're a great place to work, they're number one, let's just take exactly what they're doing and implant it at our organization, which really isn't authentic. And it doesn't necessarily get leaders excited about what you're doing. So I would love to hear from you on how you think through setting an aspiration, and also coupling in that with how you collect the right level of data when you assess. We know when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we all have positive intent. But if I'm action planning, I'm going to be action planning for myself, Drew Goldstein from Poughkeepsie, New York, as a gay, white male. So how do we make sure that we're assessing, collecting data, and using that to inform the decisions that we're making?
So I think that's a great place to start, because if you do not understand your current state, it's very hard to set an aspiration, right? So I think those first 2 A's are critical for success. So the way that we approached it is by really being methodical like you would with any other business. Let's understand where we are today before we decide where we want to be tomorrow or 5 years from now or 10 years from now. The end goal of assessment is to truly have a framework and an actual plan, a strategic plan that then you could, like your A's, act upon. So you have to collect at least 3 pieces of data in order to truly understand where you are from a DI perspective. And the first is, what is the infrastructure? What is happening at your company? How do things get done? Right? Because what makes my job or any CDO's jobs difficult is that where the work actually gets done and who owns the processes don't report to me. Right? If I want to change recruiting, I have to work with the head of recruiting. And if I want to make that process more equitable, I have to understand what the process is today, what our infrastructure is, before coming up with some grand plan of how we can do it differently in order to make the recruiting process more equitable. So really understanding your organization from the beginning to end, how do things get done, is going to be critical to how you set up your framework and your strategy. From a diversity perspective, right? If we think about the DEI, what does that mean? Well, from a diversity perspective is understanding what does your company's representation look like? Where do you have gaps, right? Because you don't have unlimited time and unlimited resources. So when you set your strategy, you're going to have to make critical decisions of what are you going to focus on first. So from a D perspective, understanding the current population, where the gaps are happening, and again, how are people moving through the organization through those processes we looked at in the infrastructure stage, and are we seeing equitable movement, right, from a promotions rate, from a leaves rate, from a hiring rate? That's going to help you really start to narrow down how do you actually then map out where you need to set some aspirational goals from a diversity perspective. The harder thing to measure is the inclusion, right? Most people measure it through pulse surveys. But we went out and we said, let's find who's ever figured out how to measure inclusion and actually bring someone in to do this in a way that will not only tell us how people are feeling today, but the why, right? Because again, you want to be as surgical as possible in picking what are your areas of opportunities from an inclusion perspective, understanding which groups are feeling more or less included, so that when you put into your plan, I want to narrow inclusion gaps, you know the how. Because if not, you're just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks.
Doing it by gut, right? Versus really knowing, right?
Versus really knowing. And I think the last thing I'll say on that is tying it back to goal and being able to truly say, if that is my goal, then what are the KPIs along the way that are telling me that I'm actually getting closer to that goal? If you're not measuring it, it's not going to get done. And having the ability to actually set your strategy up in a way where you understand what your key performance indicators are will help you on the assess part decide, is this working or not? And should I take my limited resources and move them in another direction? Because I think a lot of companies will do the copycat or, oh, this person did a reverse mentoring program, maybe we should do one, et cetera. And it's not a one size fit all. Because at the end of the day, what diversity is good management. And good management within the culture of the firm that you work for. And what that looks like is going to be different at Google than at a bank, than at an asset management firm.
That's right.
And you have to create solutions that have the ability to succeed within the culture of the firm, where the culture becomes what helps drive the change that you want to see.
That's right. I couldn't have said it better. This is exactly why we have you here. And when also what I was listening is that you think about your aspiration, then you think about assessing, going back and revisiting the aspiration, right, on a regular basis, because the two are pointing back and forth. So it doesn't necessarily happen sequentially, and you have to be agile in your process to make sure that you're measuring and managing effectively.
Absolutely. You have to keep your finger on the pulse at all times, because again, it's a living organism. A company, a culture is a living organism, and things like naturally change, and you want to make sure that as the environment is changing, the solutions that you've creating either adapt and still work for that environment, or if not, how are you going to then take your intervention and shape it to the new environment?
So we started to, or you at least started to tickle into the architect and act phase. So I'd like to jump in a little bit more and share some of the pitfalls that I see some of our clients sometimes fall into and think about how do they get out, right? So the architect, and you alluded to this, is that when we think about constructing the perfect plan, a lot of times organizations have that plan live in a silo. You are one group within the organization, and they don't think about how do they enable a broad set of leaders to cascade the actions. They're not thinking about the fact that DEI can't just be in its own pillar, it has to be integrated across the business. You gave a great example with the people processes. So would love to unpack that a little bit and how you think about action planning, because in this space, a year or 2 years ago, action planning just meant training people, right? Giving them an unconscious bias training, and then all of a sudden they're no longer biased, and great, we're now a better DE&I oriented organization, which we know it's got to be capability building that is ongoing, and it's not a one-stop shop thing. It's something that has to be sustainable and embedded in really new ways of working.
So let me take it to the 100,000 foot level.
Let's do it.
Before we even get into an initiative or a 3-year plan, you have to have a framework that you're going to work against. And that framework should really define where the work is going to get done. And once you have that framework, it almost serves as the first mapping of key stakeholders that you need to get the buy-in or voluntold to embed DEI into their work and their processes. Right. So for us, our framework consists of 3 pillars. It's our people and culture. So how do we attract, engage, develop, and advance our own people and culture at the firm? And when you think about that, who do I need to work with for attract? I have to work with the head of recruiting. Right. Who do I need to work with for development? I need to work with the L&D team. Who do I need to work with and touch to truly be able to engage an employee and advance them? I have to work and touch managers. So just by saying that is the framework, it starts to inform who are going to be the key people and groups that are going to have to drive that work if it's going to work. The second pillar for us is business and investment management. So what do I mean by that? It's one, running DEI like any other business. We have to have a strategic plan. We have to embed diversity in everybody's business plan, because it can't just be my job.
Key, everybody.
It has to be everybody, which means down to what are you doing as an individual contributor to drive an inclusive culture and support these efforts. It's about the business. How are we driving DEI into our investment processes? How do we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion when we evaluate a company? And then the last click down there is supplier diversity. How are we thinking about the way that we spend money, and are we being equitable, and how can we drive and grow more diverse businesses through our course of doing work? The last pillar is our communities. And for Aries, part of our aspiration is we want to be an industry leader. And if you want to be an industry leader, then you have to be out there in the industry finding out what is happening and helping impact industry-wide change. So for us, it's partnering with organizations like ILPA and their diversity initiative, Milken and their DEI Executive Council initiatives. So we could share best practices, learn, and hopefully, since the lack of DEI is an industry-wide problem, hold hands with our peers and our key stakeholders in the industry and be able to move the change together, but also hold each other accountable for that change. The second piece is corporate partnerships. How do we work with the organizations that are doing the work of DEI on the ground for our industry and support them to be able to drive that change? And it's things like Alt Finance, the nonprofit that we founded with 2 other asset management firms to drive diverse HBCU talent into the industry. It's partnering with organizations like Girls Who Invest, because we know that gender is still a huge opportunity in the asset management industry. And then finally, from a philanthropic perspective, how do we think about our foundation and our philanthropy with a DI lens? And as I mentioned earlier, at the key and the most critical piece of our framework is to use data, set goals, and have KPIs. We need to be able to measure the return on investment of all of our initiatives at the individual level, but also at the global level, with setting some key firm-wide aspirational goals that will be driven through that framework.
Yeah, which leads us nicely into the advance, right? Because part of what we see with organizations who fall into a trap in advance is that what we refer to is they let 1,000 flowers bloom without a plan to prune. And it sounds like you've really thought about the fact that you just don't want all these new initiatives and things popping up. You tie it right back to your aspiration. You're measuring, setting the right metrics, governance and accountability so that you can sustain that momentum. So it sounds like, again, you've really thought about this holistically, which is exactly why we wanted to highlight your story. Is there any other advice when we think about advancement in, I call it lather, rinse, repeat, right? Because these 5 A's are never over. It's a carousel, if you will, where you want to keep going round and round.
The never-ending journey.
The never-ending journey. If you're doing it right, it's never-ending, right?
The never-ending journey. It's really to go back and reassess, right? It goes back to once we are collecting that time series data, seeing where we're making wins and continuing the course, and when we're not, being okay with stopping and taking those resources and applying them in a different way. It may be that was my fire 2 years ago, but we have a bigger fire now. And if I can only choose between one or the two, I'm going to have to deal with what would make the most impact around what's happening today, but never losing sight of the long-term plan. Because what I do see happen a lot is that there's little fires everywhere, and you can easily get distracted from what you're trying to accomplish from your longer-term goals. So it's the combination of having those long-term goals, setting that strategic direction, sticking to the plan while reassessing it, and not trying to every year start something new. Right? Being disciplined, because this is change management, and change takes a long time.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to measure and celebrate those short-term wins while still knowing that I'm not seeing those roses haven't blossomed yet, but I know they're coming, and I have to stay the course. Right. And I think that's where companies and strategies go awry, is that the first sign of resistance, they decide to throw the plan out the window and start over.
That's right.
And don't focus on ensuring that you're giving the initiatives enough time before you decide to pull the plug.
Truly, we want everything so on demand, including DE&I, but it really has a lot to do with society and what got us to where we are today. We can't just unwind that in a year, right, with a quick plan or a quick PowerPoint presentation. We have to allow people to change. We have to measure and manage. And hopefully one day, 10, 20 years down the line, we'll be sitting here talking about the evolution or progression in a very different way, in which organizations maybe have embedded so much that we're not even thinking about action planning on some of these elements, because it truly is become our normal way of working.
The normal way of working. I'll end by saying that my goal is to work myself out of a job, because if we were doing DEI properly, then you wouldn't need a chief to run around making sure that it's happening and helping take that global vision and strategy and dispersing it. If anything, I become a key stakeholder where they're just reporting out all the wonderful things that are actually happening, and I could focus my time on other things instead of rebuilding processes here and there to ensure that we're driving towards equity and towards the change that we want to see.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you. It's such an honor to share the stage here with you and collaborate with you, Indhira.
Thank you so much for the invitation, for the partnership.